was a story in one of the papers that Pierre van Hooijdonk had announced he was going on strike. And that was when Ian was going on holiday, and that was me completely in at the deep end, because everybody was at Forest was so furious with what he had said in the interview with me. I then got calls from the managers saying, "What, Dave Bassett, what the hell was he saying?" I would want to be a part of it. I wouldn't want to kind of miss the boat on that, and it'd be something that I was on the outside looking in. Nothing would have stopped Adrian Doherty getting into Manchester United's first team, other than the injury that he had at the time that he had it, because he was that good. His father felt that there were unanswered questions about his time at Manchester United. Had he been looked after properly? Had his injury been looked after properly? Had he been given every chance? They felt that it was opening a can of worms that they didn't have it would raise questions that they didn't have the answers to. This is eerie. I'm going back to this place where my life changed completely. Was it 17 years earlier? That was just, it was a really emotional thing for me. Well, for Matt first of all, but for me, and I think the comments on that piece told me that the readers found it emotional too. So I kind of broke from the herd, because I was you just go stir crazy in there with the same people, same restaurants, same tensions, the same journalists, day after day.
Hi there guys, welcome back to the channel. We've got another interview for you today. My guest is Oliver Kay. He's the senior football writer for The Athletic, and we'll be talking about his life and career in football journalism. If you are new to our channel, please subscribe to us. We want to grow our channel as much as we can, and we really appreciate the support you guys have been giving us. If you want to listen to this interview on Spotify, iTunes, wherever you get your podcast, the links are in the description below. And that's where you also find our Twitter and Facebook pages. Ollie, thanks for joining us today. So Ollie, let's go back to the beginning. So what was your childhood like, and where did you grow up?
I grew up in a town called Nantwich in Cheshire, which is it was just a fairly normal market town. And in terms of this, in terms of explaining my, love of football, I think one of the great advantages in terms of that, growing up there at that particular time, and having a dad who was massively into football, but was the game of football. So he would very often on a Saturday morning, for example, look at the fixture list in a paper and say, because we had probably I'm trying to think, probably about 9 first division top flight clubs within about an hour and a quarter of us at that time, which would be the 2 Merseyside clubs, 2 Manchester clubs, Stoke, which was just down the road, and Wolves, Villa, Birmingham, West Brom. We would go to almost at the drop of a hat. When I was 6, 7, 8 years old, we would end up, he would say, let's go to Wolves, let's go to Stoke, let's go to Everton, let's go to Man City, whatever. So from an early age, I was going to a lot of matches, and then obviously I like anybody instantly developed a fondness, obsession with one particular club, and we went there a lot more. But I'd say my experience, my football fan experience, as when I was very young, was very varied in the same way that it probably has become as a journalist. But I was just one of those kids from age 6 upwards who was just absolutely, dangerously, weirdly, disconcertingly obsessed with football and every aspect of football. And if it was, if there was any football on TV, even if it was, 2 minutes on the news on a Saturday night, I would watch it or video it. And the big match on a Sunday afternoon or match of the day on a Saturday, I would always watch them. Always watch, record Sports Night or midweek sports special, just watch everything obsessively, and something, and often very often writing about it and reenacting games, in the garden or in the, playing at the park or playing in school and playing Subbuteo, and just being one of those absolute, one-dimensional kids whose life just revolves around football at the expense of pretty much everything else. Apart from Star Wars, I was in Star Wars as well.
Oh, good stuff. So, what was your sort of first foray into journalism? Did you have, I imagine, a lot of like work experience places, anything like that?
Yeah, I did, because I just got it into my head because I would watch matches and write about them and even write about matches I played in, school matches and stuff, and play Subbuteo and write about those matches against myself. Bit sad. I would just writing about football was just something I did from like a really early age. I've got the 1982 World Cup when I was 7 years old. I've got a thing upstairs with basically me writing out all the squads, including like Algeria and Cameroon and El Salvador and Honduras and stuff like that, and player to watch and stuff like that. So I think I was probably at risk of sounding a bit like that opening line in Goodfellas. As far back as I remember, I always wanted to be a football writer. But when I was at school and we had to do work experience at various points, I'd go along to my local paper, which was the Crewe Chronicle or Nantwich Chronicle, do a week here and there. And I felt like, when I went to university, I felt like, well, that will mean I've got a good chance of getting the job that I want to get when I finish. And then I did finish university, and I hadn't applied for any courses or anything like that because I'd been too busy having a good time at university and playing football and being consumed by Euro 96 and all that kind of thing. Like, I got to the end and thought, right, well, I'll apply for a journalism course now. And they said, well, what, for this year? No, of course, all the courses are taken up. So I thought, oh, right, so I actually have to go and get some work experience. So I wrote to all my, all the local papers again within that sort of catchment area that I was in within growing up, which meant the Manchester papers, Liverpool papers, down to Birmingham and Stoke, and Stoke. The Stoke Evening Sentinel got back to me and said that they just had a vacancy arisen on their sports desk, and by all means come along next week and help us out because we're a man short type thing. And I went along there and I think liked it so much that I was there for months, basically being probably a pest in many ways, but I was doing all the jobs that nobody wanted to do, and writing about grassroots football, and writing about darts and snooker and stuff like that. I just absolutely loved it, and writing on Crewe Alex occasionally. I just really, really loved it, and they treated me very well there and looked after me. And then after that, I went on a course in Cardiff, the Centre for Journalism Studies in Cardiff, which is a very good course. Got a work experience at the Nottingham Evening Post halfway through that. And as a result of that, I got a job with them. And I'd say aged 23, that's when I became not a proper journalist, because obviously a sports journalist isn't a proper journalist, but officially a journalist, a trainee journalist, who was professional in the loosest senses of the world, sense of the word.
Well, sports journalism not work, is it? When it's fun. Obviously you spoke about writing match reports for school games you played it and so on. But was journalism, was that a career aspiration for you? Was that something you wanted to get into when you were a youngster?
It was, but I mean, I would sometimes go to matches and we'd see the we'd walk past the press box on the way out, and my dad would say, oh, that was that's all the journalists doing their reports, And the one I remember is I always remember seeing is, rather than it being someone like Hugh McIlvenney or David Lacey or one of the great writers, the one I always remember seeing sticks in my mind is Stuart Hall, who was the quite a household name in those days because he was, as well as being a BBC sports reporter in the Northwest, he was the host of the It's a Knockout, which was a big TV program at the time. And unfortunately, that anecdote rather loses its sheen because of what was later found out about Stuart Hall. But yeah, that's one of the things that stuck in my mind. But I would also I would just read every word that was written about football in the papers, and that wasn't much in those days. It would often be a page of football or 2 pages of football, and then we'd get different papers in school, and I would always go to the library and look at those on a Monday and read the match reports there. But I didn't. I mean, it's not like now where there is all these journalism courses advertised everywhere, and graduate journalism courses and undergraduate journalism courses. There wasn't a sort of obvious way in, but on the other hand, it was, I would say, it was probably more. It was certainly an easier process back then, I think, to get your foot on the ladder and on those opening first few rungs of the ladder, because whereas there weren't all these courses advertised and there weren't sort of structured ways in, newspapers were still growing in that era, or advertising in newspapers was still growing in that era, and when I did my course in Cardiff, there was an expectation really that all of us, 30 odd of us on that course, would end up with jobs on local papers, or maybe even a national paper coming out of it in terms of our first jobs. And that was my experience. I think that was pretty much everybody else's experience, just because at that time newspapers were very much sort of open for business and were taking people on, whereas now there are so many students doing journalism courses, but there's absolutely no guarantee of jobs at the end of it. And that's where I have massive sympathy with a lot of these a lot of students doing that, because I think I did that route at the right age. I think even people doing it 5 or 10 years later probably found it a lot harder to get up the ladder, and I think certainly people who've done that route 20 years later finding it an awful lot harder, because although the industry, sports writing is now everywhere, and the media is now so wide, and you can have a social media account, Twitter account, WordPress account, whatever, and you can write. Anybody can write about football and be published, but being published and forging a career for yourself is harder now, I think, than it was back then. I know some sports journalists of my generation disagree and say, "Oh no, there are so many more options now." I think there are fewer options in terms of establishing a stable career.
Yeah, but that was a question I was going to ask actually. Is it harder now for younger journalists coming into the industry, because the traditional route, as in you're going to local papers like you did, and the actual standard of local journalism is declining really, and most newspapers locally seem to be putting for advertising now. So that route's shrinking compared to where it was, and social media and the internet has helped with opportunities, but in terms of a stable sort of career, that's very, it seems to be very rare now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's yeah. I think when I speak to students and people who've come off journalism courses a lot, and try to offer some kind of guidance and help, but it's so different, the industry, to what it was 22 years ago when I came off my course. I mean, there was. I would liken it slightly to the situation you face if you want to be a young, if you want to be a footballer. There are so many more kids taken on by academies these days, and yet there are fewer and fewer homegrown kids getting onto the pitch in the Premier League. That is undeniable. And with journalism, it's there are so many more courses, there are so many more people arriving out of university with journalism qualifications or sports journalism qualifications, and in many ways they've never been better prepared and were more sort of specifically prepared than I was as a 23-year-old. But are you going to get that opportunity to get the job and to shine and to do the journalism that shows your ability in a way that enables you to kind of keep moving up the ladder? And I think that is the real difference. So I feel really lucky in terms of the timing of my career, because there was also a thing with in terms of my timing and the generation I belong to, where I think a lot of, when I moved to Manchester in '99, that was at a time when a lot of the older journalists who were covering, Manchester or Merseyside or Yorkshire for the various national papers, they all seem to either retire at once or in a short space of time, or move on to Sunday papers at one time. So in a very, very short space of time, you had a change in whoever was covering. Paul Joyce took the Merseyside job for the Daily Express, Dom Fifield for the Guardian, then Andy Hunter for the Independent, and then the Guardian, and there was a really, and then the same in Manchester. Neil Custis took over at the Sun, Ian Ladyman at the Mail, Dave McDonnell for the Mirror, Danny Taylor for the Guardian, Mark Ogden and Tim Rich for the Daily Telegraph, me for the Times. It was just this remarkable turnover in a very short space of time, where a lot of us who were a lot younger ended up getting those jobs. And then obviously fast forward nearly 20 years and we're, a lot of people are still in jobs. And I think had I been 5 years younger, I would probably have found it harder to get onto that, or to make that next step on the ladder when I did.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm one of those that took sports journalism at uni and haven't been able to get into the industry. It's not something I've been looking to get into now, but I've used those skills for Half Channel and things like that. There's a lot of transferable skills which I think any journalism graduate could use in, whether it's communications or running a YouTube channel or vlogging, that kind of thing. So it's not just journalism that you can sort of use it towards.
Yeah. I'm. You're probably reassuring me there, because I've often thought, well, God, if after 23 years in journalism, you think, well, God, if it all came crashing down, what else could I do after 23 years doing this job that is basically writing about football? What could I do if it came to that? So I think in this instance, it's you reassuring me that skills such as they are transferable, even if it's just writing about football and trying to work to deadlines, which has never been my strength, the deadlines bit. But there we go.
It's a case of you're still keeping contact with, obviously your contacts over the years and stuff like, talking on video and stuff. I mean, I certainly wasn't natural, certainly not now. So you do pick it up eventually, and if you've got a platform, especially on social media, I mean, that's sort of half the battle, really.
I think it's a big part of the battle now, and it's interesting looking back even 10 years. If I think back to the 2010 World Cup, I think a few journalists, and I was one of them, and John Cross, Henry Winter, I think we were among the first UK sports journalists to get on Twitter and sort of embrace that. I was a bit of a Johnny come lately, but by the time the 2010 World Cup came around, that was when people were sort of starting to get onto Twitter, and Twitter became a big sort of it became a big deal, I think, for a lot of us during the 2010 World Cup, but also became quite a divisive subject within the industry. And a lot of people said, "Well, I'm not going to do that. It's a complete waste of time." And looking back, I think nearly everybody ended up signing up for it sooner or later, because they realised that this is the way of getting readers to read your stuff, or a readership which you might not otherwise have, and raising your profile at a time when, for the Times, I was at the Times at that particular time. We, during the 2010 World Cup, I think maybe just before or just during it, we went behind a paywall for good. So there was a danger that I would just be invisible on the internet, and I think the way we were able to use Twitter in terms of showing what the work we did, and hopefully persuading readers that we were doing something that was worth reading, that they might not be able to get elsewhere, which I think was and is the case with the Times, and certainly is the case with the Athletic, where I work now. I think that social media profile is incredibly important, and it makes me laugh, really, that someone like Martin Samuel, I remember him during that 2010 World Cup, he was like quite dismissive, saying, no, I'm absolutely not going to do it. And fair dues to him, he's stuck to it. Like, he's almost the one journalist, one leading sports journalist in the UK who said, no, I'm not going to do sports journalism. And I think you have to be seriously good and seriously influential and respected in order to have maintained that kind of profile that he's maintained throughout 10 years of steadfastly, stubbornly refusing the glamour to be on social media. But I think certainly for anybody at entry level and trying to work their way up, I think it's I just don't think you can be a journalist without it now.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you mentioned earlier that you joined the Nottingham Evening Post. You joined there in the summer of '98. I mean, that must have been a real eye opener, particularly that season, because Nottingham Forest were relegated that season. Dave Bassett was in charge, and you had Pierre Van Hooijdonk going on strike. I mean, what an experience that must have been.
Well, it was. Ian Ladyman, who's now at the Mail, was my colleague, and he was the Nottingham Forest reporter at the time, and I was kind of floating between Forest and Notts County and Nottinghamshire, County Cricket Club and the Rugby Club, despite having zero interest in and even less than zero knowledge of cricket and rugby. I was always just football. So I would kind of dip in when I would report on Forest when Ian was off, and I remember a Friday night when I'd just joined, and I'd been doing a Notts County friendly, I think, friendly at Mansfield or something like that. And then after the game, I went back to the office, and just something, a message came out that there was a story in one of the papers that Pierre Van Hooijdonk had announced he was going on strike. And that was when Ian was going on holiday, and that was me completely in at the deep end, having been there for, having been at college 4 weeks earlier or 6 weeks earlier, finding out that I'd now been left with this story of Pierre Van Hooijdonk going on strike. So that was certainly in at the deep end, and trying to, it was fine when Forest were less in the news, and you'd have almost like a free run at at the players and at the manager and so on. But at a time like that, where they become the back page story nationally, there was so much competition. And I thought, God, I've got no contacts at this club. I've got no knowledge of how to get through this. So that was a real eye opener in terms of how you have to get on top of the game and how you have to foster relationships with people so that those players and those managers and so on and the directors will pick up the phone to you and or better still, they will pick up the phone and ring you and tell you the news. That's a situation you need to get to, and I was miles away from that. But the other thing that struck me about that time and covering Nottingham Forest were a Premier League club at that time, but I used to live just literally a corner kick away from the City Ground at the time, just in an apartment overlooking flat. Let's be honest, flat. Overlooking the stadium, and I could just almost roll out of bed and go to the training ground, which was adjoining the stadium, and just wait for players to come off the training pitch and say, Colin Cooper, the captain, have you got 5 minutes? And he'd give you 15 minutes because he was a lovely bloke, and Dave Bessant and all these players, and Scott Gemmell and Steve Chettle and people like that. They were just, the culture in those days was a reporter will come and he will ask you a question. He'll ask you for 5 minutes and you'll stand and chat with him, and you might do 10, 15 minutes on the record twice a week, or you might sit there and have a cup of tea with them and chat off the record. And that was so different, so much better in terms of building up relationships as a local reporter. And Ian Ladyman, who was the full-time Nottingham Forest reporter, he was really friendly with a lot of those players, and I would go in maybe once a week or a couple of times a month and sit there with Dave Bassett, who was the manager, and that was Sam Allardyce, who was manager at Notts County at the time. That was just a real eye opener at the time. And then when I moved to Manchester, it was the same at Man City, who were in what is now the Championship at the time. They just got promoted. Sitting with Joe Royle twice a week, and he just there was hardly anyone there. There was me and Danny Taylor or I would go along from Wardle's agency, and we'd sort of mop up at Man City and provide all the copy for all the national papers. There'd be a BBC local radio reporter, a reporter from Piccadilly Radio, and that was it. You just walked in and that was it. And the guy, you'd mingle with the players, and then you'd go to Manchester United, and the same arrangement had existed there until perhaps a year or two earlier, when the barriers had started to come down and reporters were sort of kept at arm's length, and it became, well, you can only come down twice a week, or you can only come down once a week, or you can only talk to players with my permission. That being Alex Ferguson. And I think very, very quickly from that point when I got to Manchester in '99, I think the barriers almost like across the board in terms of top flight clubs, the barriers came down, and within about 5 years, you couldn't speak to anybody at any club without getting permission from a press officer first. So yeah, I just sort of caught the tail end of that culture, and I miss it really. I think it was, I'm sure that a lot of the players don't miss it, but I think in certain ways it would be beneficial to them.
Yeah, I was going to ask that actually. I mean, obviously nowadays you've got like press officers and you've got player liaisons, PR people. A lot of the top players have got entourages like actors and actresses now. So, but do you feel like you said you missed obviously those times where you could just go to the training ground and catch a player or manager? I mean, do you feel it would help players with their relationships with the media and their getting to know their personality more if they were more open to interviews with different media companies?
I do feel like advent of social media over the past decade and the growth of social media has given them a totally different platform and has enabled them to communicate in a way that they're in total control of. Well, as long as they're in control of their minds and their fingers when they're tweeting or whatever.
Yeah, Victor and Nietzsche, not so much.
Well, there's any number of mistakes, but they've become fewer and fewer, haven't they? Over the years.
Yeah.
I think people have learned the hard way in some cases. I remember Wayne Rooney within about a week of.
We asked Rio Ferdinand if he wanted to live.
Well, that was normal. I think he was just confusing it for being able to text someone. But then, somebody insulted him on Twitter, and he put them to sleep. Which was, I think as I say, people learn the hard way. Joey Barton, perhaps paid the price.
Ashley Cole, he spoke off the FA.
Oh god, yeah, the famous bunch of what's it? Is he called the FA? But it's. Social media has definitely enabled players to build up relationships with fans again. I think it's a real double-edged sword in some ways, because there's a real downside to it in terms of players becoming fixated on what people are saying about them, good or bad. And I've heard a lot from players and their agents about how certain players just become consumed by how they're being perceived on social media. Like it was often said of the previous generation of players that they would obsess about the media scrutiny on them when they were playing for England, and what are the papers going to say about my performance? What mark out of 10 am I going to get if I have a bad game? And I think that's just gone completely out the window. I don't think players even care about that now. I think they care about the way they are portrayed on social media. If they're trending in a bad way on social media, particularly through an England game, and they're being hammered and they're being mocked by these sort of banter accounts, which I just find so bloody tedious, or just by the public, it's just it's really unpleasant for them. And I think that you look at the amount of grief that somebody like Jesse Lingard has had, or Phil Jones has had, or I think that there always seem to be whipping boys at each club, but I think it's particularly pronounced when it's whipping boys with the England team. And you think, well, what would it have been like for David Beckham post '98? What would it have been like for Rooney post 2006, or Phil Neville post Euro 2000, or any of the players after Gerrard and Lampard and so on, after they failed to qualify for Euro 2008? They were just they were getting hammered, but they would have got it far worse in the age of social media. So I've gone on to something completely different, and you were asking about do the players miss that? I think that generation, that so-called golden generation of Gerrard, Lampard, Ferdinand, Terry, Cole, Beckham, Scholes, etc. Brilliant players, absolutely brilliant players. And I feel that they suffered slightly because that kind of, they'd almost been slightly put on a pedestal, and the barriers had gone up, and we weren't seeing their human side so often through the media on a day-to-day basis. They weren't communicating with the fans as much as perhaps the players of the 90s, Shearer and Tony Adams and Stuart Pearce and people like that had been used to. So they were on one hand being they were being distanced from the public, and they didn't have the social media advantage where you can perhaps cultivate your reputation a bit more. So they were having some of the benefits of being distanced from the public, but they weren't having the ability to put out their message. So I think that generation perhaps in some ways feel blessed to have not had social media, but in other ways they would feel like they were the generation that got caught between the every day's an interview culture, and having that relationship day-to-day relationship with the media, and on the other hand, the 2010s generation where there was a relationship with the fans through social media. And I think the ones who have got a good relationship with the fans through social media in some ways are in total control of their message. But to me, there's something far more human and far more organic and natural and genuine when there's a a proper interview with a journalist, and you see that, a no holds barred open interview with, it can be a newspaper reporter, it could be somebody from the Athletic, it could be TV or radio. But I think if it's a reporter, if it's, what you see with someone like Paul Pogba, for example, is a very refined, cultivated brand management through his social media, or Cristiano Ronaldo or someone like that. But you don't very often see those people sit down with a journalist and talk openly and honestly through their career and their ups and downs and what they're going through. So I think there's something really nice, I think, when you sit down with a player and they do speak openly and they do speak in a way that reminds you that that they are a human being and not just a sportsman and not just a brand.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you were at the Nottingham Evening Post, was there any stories that you broke, any exclusives, or an interview that you did with one of the players or the manager where you thought that gave you that bit of confidence where I'm making it now, I've got belief in what I'm doing?
Weirdly, a lot of the in terms of the reporting side, I think I probably did better on the cricket. So despite not really having an interest in cricket, because I was reporting on Nottinghamshire County Cricket Club, and I was basically the only one who was, I was able to build up relationships with with the chief executive there and the coach there and some of the players, and I was breaking big stories about who their overseas player was going to be, who's Shoaib Akhtar, who was one of the most famous cricket players in the world at the time, which was probably slightly lost on me, but I still so it was, I'd say that was almost so I was getting good at getting the stories through those contacts at the cricket club. But when I was reporting on Notts v Somerset on a 4-day match, I was thinking, God, what on earth do I write here? What fielding position is that? So I would basically completely blag it in terms of the fielding positions, and probably just absolutely leave out any technical detail whatsoever, and just sort of focus on the human side, or the the players' reactions, or whatever. So I don't think I was any great loss to the cricket writing fraternity. But yeah, I mean, for example, when you talk about that saga with Pierre van Hooijdonk and him being at Forest and being on strike, I plucked up the courage to ring him, and he gave me a sort of exclusive interview and outlined what his frustrations were, and that sort of the funny way things worked in those days, and they don't quite work in the same way now, but because everybody was at Forest was so furious with what he had said in the interview with me, I then got calls from the manager saying, "What, Dave Bassett, what the hell is he saying? He's saying we've broken his promise. Well, I'll tell you what, he's, this is what we told him. This is what we told him." And I said, "Okay, well, look, can I use all of that on the record?" And then that was, and he said, "Yeah, absolutely. I want that in the paper. I want that on the back page. I want that." The same prominence. So the same prominence, it got back page and an inside spread, and then you got players almost queuing up to slag Pierre van Hooijdonk off, which so I'd go down to the training ground the next day, and it was almost like a queue of them, Steve Stone and Mark Crossley and people like that, saying that how he wouldn't be welcome back, and speaking to, it then got to the point where they all clammed up, and Ian Ladyman came back from holiday, not before time, and he took control of the story, thank goodness. but then there was a point where he was off again, and this went on for months. And I rang up Nigel Ray, who was chief executive, I think, and he basically said, "Well, look, it's got to the point now where we need to be all grow up and be sensible, and if Pierre's ready to talk, then we will." So over time, I managed to build up a few back pages through cricket and through rugby, through cricket and through football, and maybe some of the rugby interviews and features that I did as well, despite, again, not really knowing one end of the scrum from another. So I managed to get some kind of basic portfolio, as you'd call it, of cuttings, so that when I came to kind of speak to the Times about 18 months later, I was able to say, well, look, I've done this, I've done that. And it probably made me look a lot more competent and experienced and hard-nosed and pointed-elbowed journalist than I was at the time. I think I was really wet behind the ears and very inexperienced and very raw and green. But I think certain stories had basically kind of fallen into my lap by being the right person in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, definitely. Just got to make the most of it. So what were the tips and tricks that you learned as a young journalist, growing through the ranks, that have really helped in your career going forward?
I wish I could remember them, because I think if I could, I'd probably start applying them again. I mean, it was totally different in those days, because you were, if I talk about Nottingham in particular, you were just trusted, and you were kind of welcome to the training ground almost with open arms, and went up to Manchester, and you could do the same at Man City, you could do the same at Bolton. Blackburn, weirdly, was a bit more controlled in the way that Man United was. Blackburn had been a big club and won the league in '95, but I think they were a second division. Yeah, they were in the second tier when I got there, got to Manchester, and yet reporting on them was this very controlled environment where it would be 10 minutes with a manager and a player every Friday morning. You couldn't go to the training ground and build up relationships there. So I had better relationships with people at Man City and at Bolton than I did at Blackburn or at Man United than at Liverpool and Everton. It was useful in that respect. But I think one thing that is very easily mistaken and missed is that I think particularly when you're a young reporter breaking in, but I think it really applies now as well for me and for everybody else, is that you can interview somebody and you can have a good half hour with somebody and have lunch or have a coffee with somebody and feel like you've really struck up a rapport with them. But in order to really build a lasting journalist contact relationship, you need to have an ongoing thing where you prove useful to them and they prove useful to you. And that's I think that's where I've been less good over the years as a journalist. I think there are journalists who are absolutely brilliant at that, and you could tell by the stories they get that they've got brilliant contacts who come to them with stories all the time. And I think I've had times when I've been that kind of journalist, but I've also, because my brief over the last 12 years as a journalist has been a broad one. I think I've been somebody who's sort of had I've not had the same depth of way of penetrating individual clubs contacts wise as you have when you're. So if I think of reporting on Man City and Man United in the 2000s, I had miles better contacts than other people at that time. Whereas now I perhaps take more of a back seat, and there might be one or two people that I talk to at those clubs who I could speak to when I need to, really, and say, look, is this right? what about if I'm writing a story on this particular issue? But I think there are other journalists who on those clubs are much better connected. So I'm not the one that will necessarily hear who Manchester United are going to sign in the next transfer window. I think there are, other journalists who are much better at that story. So I think when you're on a particular beat, you need to stay on top of those contacts every day and press them sort of every day, every week, not to the point where you're irritating them, but so that they feel it's part of their job to speak to you and to keep you in the loop. And that is a really, it's quite fulfilling to do it, but it's also quite exhausting because you're pummeling the same people for information all the time. Whereas on a broader brief, you're perhaps revisiting those same contacts once a month or once every couple of months, and you've probably got a broader perspective across the whole game rather than that narrow, very intense focus on an individual club.
Yeah, no, definitely. So in 1999, you joined the Wardle-Whittle agency, and for those 3 years or so, the clubs you covered, they had great success. I mean, Man United would win leagues easily, and then you had Liverpool winning a treble in 2001. Man City, trying to get back in the Premier League. So, that must have been a real good time to cover those clubs in that era.
Yeah, well, I was, as I said, it was working for the Wardle agency as it was known then. It's now the Wardle-Whittle agency, and I would say that was the best ground, even more than Nottingham Evening Post, in terms of. I mean, people won't know the name of the agency, but I was there. Danny Taylor was there. Mark Ogden was there. We were under Ian Whittle, who was the Northwest boss at the time, and we were all just constantly trying to get stories that would get in the national papers, and we were often because Man United would be covered by all the national papers, but they would generally neglect Man City at the time, which is not due to the fact due to any bias or dislike of Man City. It's just that Man City weren't big news at the time. So Wardle's, the guy, Danny and Oggy and I would go along to Man City on a couple of times a week and speak to all the people there, and we would provide the Man City coverage, the Bolton coverage, the Blackburn coverage, Burnley coverage, and it was great. But then Danny left to go to the Guardian, as I said, and just towards the end of that season, and I was still very wet behind the ears and learning from my own mistakes constantly. Towards the end of that 99-2000 season, the Times ended up with a sort of sudden staff issue where they needed to get a reporter on the ground in the Northwest, and so I basically was sort of drafted in to become, at the age of 25, to be their Northwest reporter, so covering all of those clubs I've mentioned, plus the Merseyside clubs, while still working for Wardle's, and that was a incredibly intense, exhausting but enlightening period for me, because I sort of went in there with no contacts at Liverpool or Everton or Man United, and was the Times' reporter on those clubs and others, and it was really, as I say, it was really in at the deep end, and I was constantly getting phone calls saying, 10:30 at night, saying Matt Lawton has done this story in the Telegraph, or Neil Custis has done this story in the Sun, or I was constantly being exposed my lack of sharpness and at the time, and I should never have got that job at that time, but I was the right person in the right place at the right time, and eventually managed to build up relationships with people at those clubs and start to get the odd story of my own, and just, but that first few years doing that job, it was like a roller coaster in terms of the reporting side of it, but also as you said, the good times covering all of those clubs. It felt like, I mean, look, Everton, there weren't good times there. They were going through a really difficult time battling against relegation, and felt like Everton was very gloomy at that time. But Liverpool were on the up under Gerard Houllier and won that treble of League Cup, FA Cup, UEFA Cup at the end of that season, and that was just mad being in Dortmund for that UEFA Cup final, 5-4 against Alaves. Manchester United were just absolutely dominant. They won their third league title, third consecutive league title that season, and yet nobody was happy because they'd lost in the Champions League to Bayern Munich, and Roy Keane was furious with his colleagues, and there was a totally different standard existed at Man United to anywhere else. But Man City got promotion that first season. Bolton got promotion under Allardyce the second season. Blackburn got promotion, and it just felt like Burnley got promotion as well. It just felt like a really buoyant time to be reporting on the Northwest.
That's good stuff. So, obviously, you mentioned context there. But for those that might not know, obviously, you hear all the time on maybe Sky Sports News, Sky Sources, or those sources. I mean, I know the reason for that is because you can't reveal your contact's name, or else they won't give you any stories or anything like that. So,
yeah.
In terms of the roles at the club, I mean, do they vary from sort of boardroom level all the way down to like maybe the kit man? Is that how it works?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it just varies from club to club, and I think it's changed a lot over the past 2 decades. I think if I go back to when I started in on the Times in 2000, I think at that time you would have the phone numbers for the managers, you'd have the phone numbers for various players, and I'd say by that time you would use them sparingly. You wouldn't ring up a manager. Look, I never ever rang up Alex Ferguson. I had a home number for him. I never ever used it because I never had a relationship with him where he would ever have picked the phone up. If I rang him at home on a Sunday night saying, "Oh look, this story is in the Daily Telegraph about Stam going to Lazio. Is that true?" I think he would have. I think I would probably have been banned or castrated or something like that. It would be he's not somebody you could ring. Gerard Houllier, I had a number for him. You could ring him in an emergency, I would say, if you were desperate, and then he would be helpful. He was always very polite, but you wouldn't want to be ringing him all the time. He was, he had a press officer, and the queries went through him basically, and he would put the queries to the manager. But chief executives at various clubs would often pick the phone up and tell you, that you could put questions to them, and they would say, "Oh, this, but please keep my name away from it." And I would often get stories that way by speaking to chief executives at various clubs or managers at various clubs who would say, "Yeah, of course, this is true," or "Yes, we are interested in this player, but don't quote me on it. Don't have my name near it." And that was generally how it worked in those days. And I would say more and more as time has gone on. In fact, on that issue, I remember there being issues at Man City where I had numbers for most of the players there as a result of going to the training ground a lot and doing interviews with them a lot over the phone. There were allegations about something at Man City at a particular time, and I was able to ring around a load of those players and say, "Look, is this true? Is that true?" And you would get a kind of gossipy version of you get each people giving a different side of version of events, and none of them wishing to be quoted because they get in trouble. But you would learn the truth that way, and you would be able to present the truth as dressing room sources, but you couldn't name your sources.
No.
And that really, a lot of the case now, I think much more so now, even chief executives, managers, directors, players agents. There would often be a case 20 years ago where you'd ring up a player's agent and they would vent their fury at a particular club for a contract offer to their client, and that would be on the record. And these days, that kind of thing never happens on the record. Everybody's always, well, look, this is off the record. Well, this, you can't quote me on this, but please do print this. So they might say now, okay, look, the club has made this offer. It's insulting to the player. They've got interest from, such and such a club in Italy, and you're then trying to think, right, okay, well, this is all very well. You're saying so and so's got interest from Italy, but you're an unnamed source in the story. I have to try and find out whether that interest from Italy is genuine. So, and then you're going around unnamed sources in Italy and trying to find the truth from there. So look, it's very, very rare. If I get a story from a manager or a chief executive or a director or a player or a player's agent or whatever, you have to try and double source it. And it's very, very often a story that nobody wishes to put their name to. So there are reporters whose currency all the time is news stories. I'm in a privileged position, I guess, now where I'm not reporting on an individual club. I'm a columnist, stroke feature writer, stroke interviewer, whatever. So I'm not constantly pressurized to get news stories.
So much.
Yeah. So those reporters who are, and they're often telling people stories that they don't. Somebody like David Ornstein or John Percy on the Telegraph or Matt Hughes on the Mail or Matt Law on the Telegraph. The journalists who are always pulling really good transfer stories, and Sammy Mockbell on the Mail. These stories very rarely have an identified source in them, and so when people don't want to hear those stories, when people don't want to hear that a player at their club has put in a transfer request or he's agreed to move to another club, or that they're a manager is thinking of resigning or a manager going to be sacked, those reporters, because people only believe what they want to believe. Readers don't want to believe that something negative about their club is true. So they'll suddenly say, well, where's your source? Where's your source? And the sources, the guys I mentioned and many, many others are so good at getting the stories from those clubs. And it's always unnamed sources. And people just have to learn to recognize that when a certain journalist says something, it's not because they've got an agenda against your club. It's not because they're making something up because they need clicks. It's because it's true, or because what they've been told is true at that particular time. It doesn't mean that player X is going to join club Y, but it means that the interest that they're reporting in a particular player is genuine. And I despair of there being outlets on the internet which will just regurgitate and publish any transfer rumor that appears anywhere without ever bothering to check it out. And that includes outlets which have their own really, really good reporters, and they should just put their faith in their own really, really good reporters rather than just seeking to regurgitate any story that anybody else has run anywhere just for clicks. That is a pet hate of mine, but it's also a pet hate of the reporters on those particular outlets.
Yeah, I can imagine. So in 2009, you became the chief football correspondent for the Times. You didn't feel you were quite ready when you were the Northern football correspondent, but did you feel after many years covering those clubs you mentioned earlier, did you feel ready to take up a really sort of high-profile position?
It felt quite daunting because I was 33 and I was following in the footsteps of Martin Samuel, who we talked about earlier, and apart from being on social media, I can't think of any advantage I had over Martin Samuel. But it's, yeah, I mean, I can't say I didn't feel ready, because I made my interest known when Martin was leaving the Mail. I said, I'd love to get the chance to do that, and I'd love to feel that you to feel that you don't need to go externally to get a replacement. And a lot of people at the time supported me, and a lot of people were a bit like, well, is he a bit young? But yeah, it was. I mean, again, when I spoke earlier about a load of us getting jobs at one time in Manchester, it was the same with sort of chief football writer job. People moved on, and so Danny Taylor became the Guardian's chief football writer. Sam Wallace was the Independent's, and then became the Telegraph's. Mark Ogden became the Independent's, and it was yeah, again a kind of. I'm really not going to disguise it. It was really being in the right place at the right time, and I thought and still feel that George Culkin, who was on a Times with me, is a vastly better football writer than I think he's just brilliant, George. Hope he doesn't hear this, but he didn't have any interest really in being the chief football writer, whereas I suddenly thought, well, yeah, I'd love to be doing that. I'd love to, I love covering that Northwest patch and doing Liverpool and Man United in the Champions League, but I would love the chance to be doing, England and doing World Cups and do the London teams and being all over and doing that roving role where you have to be sort of jack of all trades and master of none. And that was, yeah, I was quite inexperienced in that. I didn't have I didn't have relationships with people at the FA at that time. I didn't have relationship with Fabio Capello, who would just take over as England manager. I had to work on all of those things and work on trying to get some degree of inside knowledge at Arsenal and at Chelsea, knowing that there were other people that had a massive head start on me at those clubs. So that was, I think any job I've always done, I've felt like I've been very lucky to get it, and very much as though I need to, probably sort of learn on the job, because I do think you're constantly learning on the job and in this role, because people, staff, there's a staff turnover constantly at football clubs. You might have a really good relationship with a manager or assistant manager or chief scout at one club, and you might think for a short space of time. I had a time at Manchester United where I was thinking, God, I'm the guy who's I'm getting loads of stories here. I feel like I'm on top of this, and then it was a really brief period, and then that person, one of those people moved on, and another person kind of got their wings clipped for briefing a bit too much information, and I felt like I was back to square one. That happens all the time with journalists, with contacts. Ownership changes at clubs, managerial changes at clubs, and reshuffles behind the scenes. They impact massively on journalists' networks of contacts. So you just have to be you have to adjust constantly. And I'm not saying spare a thought for the journalists, but sometimes a managerial change will be really bad news for a particular journalist covering a particular club.
Absolutely. So, obviously being the chief football correspondent, you would have gone to many of the title deciders or title clashes, top six games. I mean, did you? Was that something you enjoyed? Did you enjoy covering like the big matches?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was. I was often at big matches before and doing, Liverpool and Manchester United in the Champions League and Champions League finals and stuff like that, and huge games. But there would also be big games before that I would miss out on, and big games in London, big international games, etc., big Champions League games, and I think I think as one change when I became chief football correspondent was that I suddenly had my pick of the games, and I was always where I wanted to be, and that was being at World Cup final. That's I mean the 2010 World Cup final was terrible. One of the worst games I've ever been at, and but what an incredible buzz and privilege to be there, and the same in 2014, 2018, European Championship finals, Champions League finals, title deciders. But also, going to big, FA Cup third round games, and going to AFC Wimbledon against Liverpool and that kind of thing, where you've got that, crackle of atmosphere where it's everyone's hoping is an upset. Notts County against Man City. I love Blythe Spartans. Blythe Spartans against Blackburn was one of the first games that I covered in that role at the Times, and it just, I love feeling like I'm at those big games, and doing those match reports that people are reading the next day. And I remember doing it was the FA Cup semi-final when Stoke played Bolton. Stoke thrashed Bolton 5-0. It was an incredible game, and probably I think most Stoke fans would say that was their highlight of the past, probably the best game of their lifetime in many ways. And somebody once emailed me and said, I've got your match report of that game on framed in my toilet. And I thought, God, that's one of the nicest things anybody's ever said to me. It's not the if you're getting correspondence from a fan which involves your newspaper clipping being in their toilet, that's not quite the that's not quite what you're expecting. You're always expecting they say the opposite. But it's so that doing those big matches and big match reports was great, and just something I always love being in being at those big matches. None better than Man City 3, QPR 2 in 2012, which is I'd say it's still the most amazing thing I've witnessed in a football ground.
No, definitely. Just watching it was something else. So, like many of your peers, you joined the Athletic last year, along with Danny Taylor, as you mentioned, Dom Piper, who's been on this channel, David Ornstein, amongst others. So, why did you join the Athletic?
Well, I was happy at the Times. I was not looking to get away, and not I adjusted to a slightly new role there, and I was enjoying that, and enjoying the challenge there, enjoying the people I was working under. We'd had a new sports editor, Alex Kajelski. I was loved working for him, and this thing came up, and it was Ed Mallion, who had been sports editor at the Independent. He said, "Look, there's something I want to talk to you about. Would you be interested in having a chat with these people? Have you heard of the Athletic?" And I thought, well, yeah, I've heard of it. I don't really know much about it. It's an American website. I heard that it was making a big impact there in America, but I didn't really know anything about it. So he said, the people from the Athletic are over in London in a couple of weeks. Do you want to have a chat with them? So I thought, well, yeah, of course. They might be saying, would you be able to do a column for us or something like that? And I was thinking, well, yeah, that might be something I could potentially do if I could find time in the week to do a weekly column for them or something like that, or an occasional piece. Who knows? So I went to that quite open-minded, and I went into this meeting in a hotel in London. I just interviewed Hugo Lloris that afternoon before the Champions League final, and sat down with Alex Mather and Adam Hansman from The Athletic, and they made it clear that they were going to launch in the UK. They had massive plans. They wanted to get a whole load of journalists, a specialist on each club, the best specialist that they could get on each club, a load of general writers such as myself and George Calkin and others. Well, I didn't name names at that time, but it was the vision that they laid out as to how this was going to work, what the role would be, what the model would be, how they were going to try to attract subscribers and grow as a company and become the place for football coverage in the UK. I just thought it sounded absolutely amazing, and I kept saying, look, who are you? Who are you interested in? Have you thought of speaking to this person, that person? If we're really going to make this successful, they would never commit to names, but they said, look, any name you think of that you think should be part of this, the chances are we're speaking to them, because we know the kind of people we want, on the desk side, on the writer side, on the reporter side. And I just thought, God, this sounds really, really incredibly good. This sounds like something that I would want to be a part of. I wouldn't want to kind of miss the boat on that, and it'd be something that I was on the outside looking in. So I know a lot of people have talked about, they must have been offered loads of money and stuff to go there, and they must. Money was never discussed on that first meeting, but I came out of that with my head spinning, thinking. When I called my wife, I said, you know what? I think not only do I think I might be interested in doing some work for them, I think I want to work for them. I think this is what I want to do. I think this is the project is so good. I want to be a part of it if things add up. So I think for about the next 2 weeks, I kind of was talking to them on and off, and got to the point where I went to the Europa League final in Baku and the Champions League final in Madrid, and my head was just spinning, thinking, these might be the last matches I ever cover for the Times. If this is as it seems, I just was so into what I'd heard from the Athletic and the way they were going to map things out in terms of giving you total freedom to write about anything and as much time and as much space as you wanted to write about anything. So at the Europa League final, Amy Lawrence, who was there for The Guardian, came up to me and she was like, so, and just sort of, any news? And I was like, oh, you're right. Are you thinking about, are you referring to what I think you're referring to? And so eventually, over the course of those weeks, a few of us managed to work out, piece together who had been approached and who was considering offers and who was tempted. And I think we were all, I think even some who ended up erring on the side of caution and staying put or whatever. I think a lot of people were very tempted by what they'd heard, and I decided. I told the Times, I think a couple of days after the Champions League final, that I'd got this offer, and I was minded to go. And around the same time, I heard that George Calkin, who I've referred to, Alex Kajelski, who I've referred to, they'd also been lined up, and I think that pushed me from 95% keen to 100% keen, because I knew, once I knew that they were going to be involved, that it was going to be a really, really good project. It was going to be something I, as I said, I really, really wanted to be part of. And I would hated to have been on the outside looking in as they launched it, and feeling, God, I wish I was a part of that. Because I think although I mean, I was on the outside looking in when it launched in August, because I didn't leave the Times till September, till I'd started until I'd finished my notice period. But so I was envious then. I just wanted to be part of it then when it launched. But I knew that I was going to be there within weeks. And although the Times, being at the Times for 19 years was amazing. I was there from the age of 25 to 44, which sounds like one of those, when you're filling in your ages on one of those questionnaires, 25 to 44. So it felt like there was a period of my life, whole period of my life was spent working at the Times, and it just felt like the right thing at the right time. And did I want to spend the next 20, 25 years working for the Times and doing the same job for the same people in a knowing the challenges that the newspaper industry was facing? And I ended up thinking, well, no, as much as I've loved working for Times, I think I want to try something different. I think this feels like the one time where, the one thing at the one right time to take a jump. And I'm normally a very hesitant, indecisive person, but I just felt with the Athletic, it just totally felt like the right thing at the right time.
Good for you. You mentioned earlier about doing more sort of features and focusing more on interviews, that kind of thing. And did that obviously appeal to you, and the fact that word count's not really a problem anymore, and obviously there's still deadlines, but not strict as there would be, 10:30 deadlines for maybe match reports. Like, did that sort of play into your thinking as well?
Yeah, I'm somebody who would always relish every extra minute that I could get writing an article. So if I was, when I was at the Times and writing live match reports, to a sort of deadline on the final whistle, I found that really difficult. And it's when you want to write something that people are going to want to read the next day, I never felt satisfied just sort of doing an intro based on just if there was a last minute winner or whatever, just sort of panicking and writing, oh, blah, blah, so and so scored a last minute winner, and then the rest of it just be as it was. I always wanted to, I don't know what the word is, but refine it or improve it. And I never felt happy when I had to press the button when they were screaming down the phone line saying, look, we need it now, we need to get off stone, send it now. And I would always, the time we had to rewrite things afterwards, I always wanted more time, because I thought, well, this is mad. We're writing match reports on the final whistle when we haven't had time to even watch a replay of a certain incident. I haven't had time to think what this means, or to put things in context, or at least to write 1,000 words in context. I mean, you can certainly think what the result means, but it's hard to have a considered view. Or you would, on a Friday afternoon, you would interview a footballer at the training ground, and you'd end up with, say, 6,000 words of quotes where they've gone into their life story. They've said something incredibly interesting, or they've talked about this and that, and you go onto the desk and you'd say, well, how much space have we got? And they said, well, look, you know what the Saturday paper's like. We've got ads, we've got this to get in, we've got that to get in, and the times are really good for this. But a good run on an interview would be sort of 1,500, 1,800 words, and very often it would be less than that. Or very often you'd start on that, and then you'd be told, well, there's an ad has come in, it's got to be squeezed. And I was one who would generally get a good show. I wouldn't sort of suffer too much from word counts, but there were sensible limits on what you could get on a newspaper spread, and things always needed to be done within a certain time frame. Whereas if I'm and that also made you, although you'd try to get interviews and good interviews, you would sometimes shy away from proposing certain projects or certain feature ideas because you thought, well, that is just too deep for a newspaper article. It's too broad for a newspaper article. And The Athletic was offering something where you could do those big, deep projects, and you could, if you were doing something in depth, you wouldn't be told, well, okay, this is 1,000 words. You'd be told, look, just tell us what you think it's worth. Take as long as you need to write it. So, for example, one thing that when I went there, Alex, one of the first things he said when I went there in the September is, when Liverpool play Man City in November, I don't want you to go. I don't want you to do that match. I said, all right, okay. Well, I'd like to do that match. It's it's going to be a big match. He said, I want you to go to Senegal and go to Sadio Mane's village and watch the match from there and tell the readers what that's like. And I thought, God, that sounds mad. And he said, I'd have loved to have done that at the times, but the budget would have been difficult, but also it would have been difficult to justify sending somebody there to do a piece that would realistically have been probably at an absolute stretch 16, 17, 1,800 words. Whereas what I want you to do is go and, if possible, try and meet his family, tell his life story, go and meet his friends, say what it's like, say where it is. And so I flew to Guinea-Bissau and travelled over the border from there. Had this most amazing few days, really, travelling around Senegal. And it's absolutely the back of beyond, Bambali, this small village. There are images really of where footballers in Africa grow up, and they're often in these very densely populated areas, like I saw in Bissau, and like you'd see in Dakar or Nairobi or places like that. But this was a village with no real football pitch. It was children playing around the well, mud huts, chasing chickens around, and it was the most eye-opening thing for me. Not as a football writer, but also as a person who'd never seen that sort of remote part of rural Africa. And I knocked on his the door of his family's house. Well, I drew up in Bambali and said, look, which one's Sadio Mane's house? And some kids directed me to it, and it was just it was just lovely. Went in and just spoke to his family in my sort of quite lapsed French, and they gave me his life story, and showed me the hospital that he had sort of had built for the village, and the school that he had built for the village, and talked about everything that he'd done for the family and done for the people of the village and the region. And I said, look, can I come back tomorrow and watch the game with you? And they said, yeah, of course. And so I then watched the match with them, and that was just brilliant. If I think about how much I'm missing football right now, and I miss the atmosphere in stadiums massively, but I also miss seeing what it meant to those people. if you think how proud, Spurs fans singing, Harry Kane is one of our own, or Man United fans of Marcus Rashford, or Villa fans of Jack Grealish, or whatever. Liverpool with Trent Alexander-Arnold, or Chelsea with their new wave of players. And you think what it means to see a local boy in that team. But when you see what it means to the people of Bambali and to Sadio Mane's family, to see their Sadio playing in that, the biggest match on earth that day and scoring the winning goal, that was just absolutely amazing. I love that. Of all the things I've done for the Athletic, I think that is my favourite. But the point I'm getting back to really is that if I'd done that for the Times, it would have been, as I say, it would have been probably a third of the size of the piece, and I would have been able to do a decent piece, but I was able to go into it in so much more depth. And that's, I've had interviews like that. The first piece I did for the Athletic was with Matt Jansen, who, people might remember from Crystal Palace and Blackburn, and he had a meteoric rise when he was a young player, but then he'd had a motorbike accident when he was on holiday, and he'd suffered brain damage and never been able to get his career back on track after that, and he'd ended up having a sort of love-hate relationship with football. And I interviewed him, but I took him back to Rome where the incident had taken place, and we did an interview which was, again, probably 3 times longer than anything I would have been able to do in the Times, and it was just amazing. That was a real. I'm not saying it's an amazing piece of journalism, but it was an amazing thing to be able to do and to tell that story in great depth, a depth that I wouldn't have been able to do. And that's what I love most about journalism. It's telling those stories and ideally being able to tell them in great depth. And I think also for people who are covering clubs, I think a lot of people, if you look at James Pearce, who came from the Liverpool Echo, Paul Taylor from the Nottingham Evening Post, Phil Hay for the Yorkshire Post, etc., they had been used to a model of reporting on their team where it was about often writing 4 or 5 stories a day, because that's what the online model at those particular papers was. It was about sort of generating as much content as possible, and now they're reporting on those clubs in a totally different way, where they're able to just spend all their time either getting the best news stories they've got with the extra time they've got, or going into a depth that they would never have been able to do at their previous papers. So yeah, I think that's I know I've been going on for ages, but it's that thing of being able to tell the stories in depth rather than just sort of scratching the surface of the story.
That's great. No, thanks for sharing that. So obviously the Athletics behind the paywall, and there's other, media companies like the Times who used to work for example, that have worked behind the paywall. But in terms of that model, and even just how articles look on the internet, on their website, apps, etc., do you feel that media companies have made the most of what the internet can offer?
What you mean, the way the Athletic do it?
In terms of like all sort of media companies, like in terms of like will paywalls help? I mean, and in terms of styles of what it looks like on websites and apps and stuff, do you feel like there's more scope for improvement for different media firms?
Well, I've got to say, when I was going to go and see the Athletic about whatever conversation they wanted to have with me, and I downloaded the app and gave it a free trial, and the app itself, the app itself is just so much slicker and cleaner, I think, than I think the news, without wishing to be unfair, than the newspaper apps are. I think they put an awful lot of money into making sure it's the best, sort of cleanest, most visually appealing reader experience they could. And if I go onto the App Store and see which apps need updating, The Athletic is just constantly updating, bug fixes, etc. Where, to be honest, I've never even seen a bug on the Athletic app. They are constantly improving it and improving the visibility, improving everything. And I think with newspapers, even those who are, the BBC, I'm not going to make it about newspapers. The BBC, their app is good. BBC Sport app is good, but it looks very much as it did 5-6 years ago. It's not something that seems modern or particularly slick. It just serves a purpose, really, and you can tell it's not something that the BBC or that any paper is making their absolute priority. Because if you go into a newspaper office, even now, and even probably at the Guardian, which has got a very digital first approach, so much of the attention is on getting things that fit the layout of a newspaper, because they don't want to have to sub-edit everything twice. They want to present the stories online in a way that reflects the way they present them in the newspaper, which is so you've got the whole editorial model is based on the paper, which is this thing which I love. I still love newspapers, but they have a declining readership. A lot of the readership now is online, and yet the newspaper format, I think, still dictates the way that a lot of the papers think and do things. Whereas at the Athletic, it's all about the app, and that allows us to do. We don't have to think about, if we get a news story, we don't have to think about it fitting in 300 words on a back page and then telling it in another 600 words inside, and with maybe a small comment off it. We tell a story. We don't need to sensationalize a story so that it's strong enough to be on a back page. We can tell a story with nuance that says that a story is, a club might be interested in a particular player, but we're not having to put a big, we're not having to tie our colours to the mast of, Raheem Sterling is joining Real Madrid or Sadio Mane is joining Barcelona, whatever. It's a different thing where you're able to just approach stories in a different way and just reflect a possibility in the transfer market, or you're able to reflect an incremental movement in a particular story, or you're able to reflect a story which you don't particularly feel needs to be given the hard news treatment, but maybe is better treated as a comment. And I think these are all advantages, I think, and whereas in that that newspaper format, you do have to sometimes make a story a bit harder than you'd like to in order for it to justify being on the back page. And that's we've all been on that, in that situation as newspaper reporters, where you think, God, this story, I don't really want it to be flammed up as big exclusive on the back page, or I don't want it to be, I feel like it's a bit more uncertain than that. But it's going to have to be the back page lead because it's a quiet day, and that is something which that is something where we do have an advantage at the Athletic, because people can see that stories aren't having to be spun into something that they're not in order to merit a certain prominence. You're on the app, you see there's this news story, but I don't think they're ever sensationalized. I don't think it's ever the reporter who wants to sensationalize the story in newspapers. I think just sometimes things have to be sensationalized to slightly in order to fit a back page model, and that's what we don't have to do. And I think that probably helps in terms of trust from readers.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And obviously we've just been about the Athletic and the rise of websites and apps and so on, and also YouTube. There's grown big in the last few years. Pretty much every team's got their own fan TV channel now. You've got Arsenal's AFTV, Redmen TV, Liverpool, West Ham Fan TV. So, what do you make of these sort of fan TV channels?
I think it's. I mean, it feels like the whole. It feels like a lot of what people think of those fan TV stations channels is perhaps based on what they think of the Arsenal one, because that obviously is that's been the most high profile one and sort of most notorious in some ways. But I can, it was interesting to me that there was like quite a backlash against that when things were getting very tense under Wenger and then under Emery, and I mean it's an interesting model, definitely. I mean to me it's an extension of the old fanzine culture of the 80s and 90s. I mean it's
and phone-ins as well,
and phone-ins and everything else. But the difference being that it's those fanzines were previously you'd read them, but they wouldn't necessarily dominate the discourse, because even if they were very well read, they were just read by lots of people separately. Whereas now you have fan TV channels that a load of people are watching at any one time, and that does, it does seem to sort of, particularly if we use the Arsenal one as an example, that did seem to sort of shape the media and fan narrative around the club at that particular time. So that that in itself is an interesting phenomenon, because I think there was a lot of backlash against some of the individuals involved and against the entity of Arsenal Fan TV. Now, I know people have said, well, these are just, with some of the fan networks, etc., that they are, they're not sort of pure creations. They've been created by media groups, etc. I've no idea what the truth is about that, but to me, they're worthwhile enterprises, and if they attract extreme opinion, then that, I don't think that should be allowed to sort of dictate what everyone thinks, that an entire fan base thinks. And I don't really like the idea of people just sort of acting up to a particular image or whatever. But I think the idea of fans with microphones outside stadiums and asking each other what they think and saying what they think, I think that's entirely healthy. I think that's, I think if you went outside any stadium on any given match day in the good old days when there were such things as match days and crowds, I think it's generally it would generally be a good sort of barometer of what the feeling is amongst a fan base at any particular time. I think it's what happened with the Arsenal ones is that it came at a time when tensions were running very, very high, and if anything, it became sort of self-perpetuating thing where emotions ran higher. But I see there are big fan groups that do the same with Man United and Liverpool, and they don't seem to have the same issue. They seem to be a lot more moderate, win, lose or draw, and I think maybe it did reflect the kind of volatile atmosphere inside Highbury Emirates at that particular time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So in 2016, you released your first book, Forever Young, the story of Adrian Doherty and football's lost genius. And he was a youngster at Man United, very highly rated by the people who spoke to, Ryan Giggs, for example, but ultimately didn't play a first team match for the club. But before you got into it, when did you realise that this would be more than a newspaper feature?
It was initially intended as a newspaper feature, and I went over to see Adrian's family in Strabane in County Tyrone with the intention of doing a newspaper article, and they said that, to be honest, they didn't really feel comfortable with the idea of doing a newspaper article at that time, and it was that was a sort of ongoing conversation with them. But because I built up this interest in his story, and because it really intrigued me as a story that, of a footballer who was of outstanding promise and was sort of enjoyed top billing with Ryan Giggs in that Manchester United youth team, who then disappeared completely from the world of football within a very short space of time, and then tragically died not long after that. I think it was just something that I immediately thought, this is a story I really need to get my teeth into and try and work out, what went on and what happened and what the real story was with this guy. And the deeper I dug, which I continued to do even when his family was saying that they didn't really want to do an article, but I kept digging because I thought, well, this just fascinates me, and I hope that at some point they will agree to do an article. But as I just found out more and more and more about him, it seemed to be one of those things that, you could do a newspaper article, and I wouldn't have done it without their permission. But if I'd done a newspaper article, it would have just scratched the surface of his story and said the bare facts. Whereas in fact, there was so much more to his story. He was this sort of bohemian figure with loved poetry and loved music and loved Bob Dylan and went busking on match days. And I just, he'd then gone to, he grew up in the Troubles in Ireland in the 70s. And there were just so many strands to this story, and disappearing into obscurity and working in a chocolate factory in Preston, and then working as a sort of, or existing as a sort of little known poet musician in Galway, and then the mystery surrounding his death. It just felt like it felt like it was a book, basically, rather than a newspaper article. And I talked earlier about the constraints of a newspaper, and if I think, if I'd run that story in the Times or in any other newspaper, or even at the Athletic, you could not have told the story properly, or properly at all, because it merits the depth that, particularly if you're telling that story for the first time, it has to be done in depth. As it happened, his family didn't want to do a newspaper article anyway, but over time they kind of warmed to the idea of doing a book. So that's how it really became a book. And then it was a case of me trying to persuade publishers that this footballer that they'd never heard of merited a book. But there was no doubt in my mind that with everything I knew about him that it did. And so it was just a case of trying to find a publisher who shared that belief. Thankfully, Quercus did.
Absolutely. I mean, why do you think his story wasn't really told before? I mean, only seems to be players that he played with, and obviously Sir Alex Ferguson and a few of the staff that actually sort of knew of him. It seems to have been sort of airbrushed in a way. Would that be fair?
I think it was fair to some extent. Yeah. I think. I mean, without wishing to go into too much detail, his family basically, or his father, felt that there were unanswered questions about his time at Manchester United. Had he been looked after properly? Had his injury been looked after properly? Had he been given every chance mentally and physically to recover from the injury? And so that had been a sort of long-running disagreement between the club and Adrian's family, and they ran a very small article in the club magazine in 2006, I think it was, about him, which was on the family's, not instruction, but it was a sort of a move towards some kind of peace offering towards Adrian's family. The family felt that article, although welcome, didn't really begin to address some of what they wanted it to, and I think the ill feeling lingered really, and as Jimmy, Adrian's father, did more and more digging about the injury and about the way Adrian had been looked after or not, both when he was there and afterwards. So I feel, realistically, I feel that had it not been for all of that, Manchester United would at very, very least have done. They would have done a documentary on MUTV or something like that. They've done some lovely documentaries on players who didn't quite make it, and Giuliano Majorana and names like that from the same era, Ben Thornley. And to me, the fact that Adrian's name was just sort of left to go quiet did reflect a sort of sense of, how would I put it? I mean, airbrushing is a slightly different term, because, I mean, realistically, he didn't play for Manchester United's first team because of the injury he had and the timing of it. So really, it was going to take for Manchester United to shine a torch on his name and his story, and they didn't do that, beyond that one magazine article. And they, when I spoke to Ryan Giggs about Adrian, and he absolutely raved about Adrian, as Gary Neville did, as Gary Pallister did, as all these players who played with him did, and Mark Bosnich, and so many. Everyone just raved about his pure talent and just how good he was, age 16, 17, how he was running rings around the first team, how he was up there with Giggs at that age. And Giggs in particular said, well, I said, well, look, do you mind me asking, why have you never mentioned him before in any interview, in any of your books? Why have you never, ever mentioned him? And he said, maybe it was just a sort of slight sense of awkwardness because I didn't know what had happened. And because I think one of the others said, well, it felt like because his name wasn't out there, if you did mention him, and if you did say, yeah, there was this amazing player who didn't make it, got injured, drifted out of football, and he died, they felt that it was opening a can of worms, that they didn't have it would raise questions that they didn't have the answers to. And I can understand that. I really can understand that from a club point of view and from an individual player's point of view. I felt when I set out on that process, and I felt that there was going to be a reluctance from certain players to contribute to the book. I wasn't convinced that Alex Ferguson would contribute to it, but they did, and they absolutely raved about him. And I think they were all, on an individual level, happy to contribute to telling his story. And as Alex Ferguson said, I think it was something like the boy with the most amazing football skill who seemed happiest with his poems and his guitar, which I think is a beautiful line. And that line is on the back of the hardback, certainly. But I don't think on it's a corporate level, I don't think there is the same willingness or eagerness from Manchester United to contributing to telling the story.
Thank you for that. From what Ryan Giggs and the other people we spoke to in the book, I mean, how good did they say Adrian could have been?
I think not how good he could have been, but how good he was, age 16, 17. I mean, Ryan Giggs and everybody else basically says that the two of them were neck and neck in that youth team. And where it gets slightly confused is that people think that means the class of 92, the Beckham, Scholes, Giggs, Neville, etc. He wasn't in the class of 92. He was basically class of 90, 91. He was 6 months older than Giggs, who in turn was a year older than those others. So when I'm talking about Adrian, this is but by the time the class of 92 came along, Adrian was basically finished as a footballer. He got injured in early 1991 and never really got any kind of career again after that. But in terms of 89, 90, 91, when he was an apprentice and then a first-year pro, everybody says he was as good as Giggs. Well, not everybody. Some say Giggs was better. Some say he was better. Most of them say the two of them were neck and neck. And Giggs says that there were times when he was when Adrian was much closer to the first team than Giggs was, and there were sort of as the two of them went through peaks and troughs in terms of the development in those periods. One was closer and then the other was closer. But at the time that Giggs got into the first team in February 91 for the first time, Adrian had travelled with the first team squad as a 14th man for a game at QPR a few weeks before that. He had also, he was basically next in line, ahead of Giggs, and then he got injured, and there was this injury crisis, and then Giggs got back in. It was perfect timing for Giggs, who, let's be honest, Giggs would absolutely have made it anyway. Giggs, nothing apart from serious injury would have stopped Ryan Giggs getting into Manchester United and Manchester United's first team and having the career he had, which was an amazing career. Nothing would have stopped Adrian Doherty getting into Manchester United's first team other than the injury that he had at the time that he had it, because he was that good. What would perhaps have stopped him having the career that Ryan Giggs had, and I don't think he would have had the career Ryan Giggs had, is not ability, it's personality. And at no point in the book do I suggest he would have had what was it, 23 years in Manchester United's first team that Ryan Giggs had, which is just an unbelievable, exceptional career. Adrian was a completely different character, which to me made his story much more interesting than Ryan Giggs's anyway. I never, even when Ryan Giggs was probably seen as a bit more of a one-dimensional character, I never thought Ryan Giggs would have made an interesting book. What makes Adrian Doherty a fascinating book is not just the fact that he was an extreme talent, or that he was one of these extreme talents who didn't make it. It's the fact that he was this extreme talent who had a completely different personality to 99% of footballers, and he was not just away writing poetry on his afternoons off, but he would give his complimentary tickets away, and he would go busking in the city centre on a Saturday afternoon while his teammates were watching the first team. And he was just a completely different personality. He didn't have the same. He was into philosophy. He was into esoteric thought. He was into anything and everything that theology, transcendental meditation. He was just into everything he read about, and it made him a fascinating footballer. But I also feel it made him somebody that had he had the first team, had he had that first team breakthrough as he would have done, but for the injury, I think he would have spent a relatively short time. I think he would have made an amazing impact because of his ability and his courage and his fearlessness. But whether that meant 1 game, 5 games, 10 games, 50 games, 100 games, I think he would have sooner or later just got bored of football, disillusioned with football, and just thought, you know what, I just want to go and be able to sit in a bar with a guitar and with strumming away in peace. I don't want the hassles of being a footballer and the pressure of being a footballer and not being able to be myself. And again, this is what drew me to his character and drew me to his story. The fact that, or the feeling that, not only was he denied the career that he would have had, but that I think his career would have been something that was unique in that he would have walked away from Manchester United, even if he'd been a star in the first team, within 2, 3, 4 years. So some people have said to me, well, if he'd made it, if he'd nailed down that place on Man United's right wing, we might never have heard of David Beckham. And I think, well, you know what, by 1995, when David Beckham broke into the first team, Adrian might have just tired of it anyway. He might just have disappeared in a puff of smoke like George Best or like Eric Cantona. I think he had that kind of impulsiveness and individualistic streak that would have made sure that he didn't have a career like Ryan Giggs, and that to me makes him all the more fascinating.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Now, Adrian, unfortunately, you talked about injury. He ruptured his cruciate ligament. Well, still a bad injury now. Would probably be treated better nowadays rather than back then. And does it remind you a little bit of Paul Lake, who was at Man City, but again very highly rated? He picked up injuries which would have been pretty easily treated now, but back then, not so well, and he seemed a bit phased out from Man City's history. Is there a bit of a similarity there?
There is, yeah. I mean, Paul, I've interviewed Paul Lake and I've met him a couple of times, and he actually came along to an event at Waterstones in Manchester where we were talking about Manchester youth football in general, and he was publicising his book and I was publicising mine, and there are certain parallels. Yeah, definitely. I think that the difference really is that Paul Lake he was having a brilliant career until the injury. And I remember Paul Lake when I was a kid. He was a brilliant footballer, and everyone was saying he was, a future England international, future England captain. And he really wasn't far from doing that. I think he was on the long list of players for the 1990 World Cup squad. And so he had those sort of 3-4 years of really good football career, and for him to have that taken away from him, and really to be replaced by 4 or 5 years of constant struggle to get back, that was heartbreaking for him. And you sense that heartbreak reading his story, and I totally recommend that book to anybody who hasn't read it. Buy that book once they've bought mine. So there are parallels, but the difference, I suppose, is that Adrian hadn't made the first team, and I think wasn't. Yeah, I mean, Paul Lake was one of Manchester City's most prized players at that time, and although he felt like he was treated like a second-class citizen after the injury, which I'm sure he was, I mean, Adrian was not so far on in his career, hadn't made the first team yet, and was down the list of priorities from the first team players. So as much as he was considered a brilliant young player, he was also one who was not the club's priority when they had Mark Hughes on the treatment table, of Brian Robson on the treatment table, ready to get ready for the match that Saturday. And so he was, and there's also the fact that his cruciate ligament injury was not diagnosed for 6 months. So having seen all the doctor's notes from that period, he was just being, he didn't have a proper scan on his knee for 6 months. And it was only then at that point, once it wasn't getting better, that they thought, oh, right, well, it turns out there is an injury to a tear to the cruciate ligament. So, yeah, definitely the injury was not treated as it would have been, or would be in modern times, and would even have been 2, 3, 4 years later. I mean, Roy Keane did his cruciate knee ligament in 1997, and I think it was probably a worse injury than Adrian's at the time, but he was able to undergo an operation sort of almost straight away and be back on a pitch within a year or so and get back to his brilliant best. And there are players who have got back from cruciate ligaments almost better than ever, or at least with no real lasting damage. I think Adrian, because he was such a quick player, might have struggled anyway to get over that injury, even if it was even if it had been successfully operated on immediately. But yeah, it was certainly an era when it wasn't the time to rupture your cruciate ligament, that's for sure.
Definitely. Well, thanks for all those thoughts, Ollie. If you want to buy Ollie's book, links in the description below. I highly recommend everyone go and read it. It's a good read. Okay, we're moving on now. So over the years, you've been a regular on the Sunday Supplement on Sky Sports. What's it like being on a flagship show like that? Obviously talking football with your fellow peers.
It's really enjoyable, actually. I mean, I wasn't really somebody who often watched it, so I didn't really have. I mean, just because, I mean, not because I don't think it's good. I think it's a very good program. But just Sunday mornings, I would either be working or I would be not working and not watching the TV. You know, I'd be doing something with my wife and my children, etc. So generally, for that reason, I didn't really watch it. So I'd never really thought of, oh, I'd like to be on it. But when I was asked, it felt like quite a big thing. But people who, mates of mine say, "Oh, are you nervous on that?" And I just say I'm not at all nervous on that, because it just feels like just sitting around a table talking about football. I don't really get nervous about that kind of thing at all. That just makes me too comfortable and makes me mumble and just bang on incoherently like I am doing now, ramble, rather than just give short, snappy, prepared answers like some are very good at. And, some people are really, really good on TV, and I don't think I'm good on TV at all. But it's so it just seemed to me to be something that I would be quite happy to do, rather than something I was desperate to do or that I would thought a great deal about. And it's nice to do it, and it's good debate, I think. Load of fans of different clubs are convinced that the whole media is against them, the whole show's against them, and they tune in every week to tell you they hate the show. And I think if people are tuning in every week to tell you that terrible show again, lads, it probably tells you that they enjoy the show a bit more than they realise. But I think it's a really good show, and it's you get your breakfast as well. Yes, those in answer to the questions, yes, the food in the middle is real, sometimes a bit stale, and it does get eaten during the ad breaks.
Well, we asked Don Fife about it, are the croissants through, and he said, yeah, and sometimes even if the guests don't eat them, the producers will break them apart to make it look like that you've actually been tucking in.
Yeah. You always have to have something on your plate. This is a trade secret. They always have to have something on your plate, just so that there's not a massive glare, reflective glare on the on your forehead. Example. I think that's the reason why. Anyway, they're always keen for you to have something on your plate, and I thought it was about colour or promoting healthy living, but no, they sometimes stick a croissant on your plate. And I know people have definitely had a bite during the show. They have, but it wouldn't be for me because I like to save my food. So there'd always be the danger that I would still be when the cameras went back on me. Yeah.
Like Paul Mercer on Soccer Saturday. Obviously you've achieved a lot in your career so far. But what would you say has been the highlight of your career?
Highlight as an actual achievement or accomplishment?
Yeah.
I don't really. God.
Or maybe a memorable interview, or or a particular match you've watched. That's been the pinnacle for you.
Two things that I think are important to say about this job is one is that it's really enjoyable, and I think everybody who does it appreciates that it beats proper work, and it's not like the normal job that most people have. But two, it's really hard work. Not hard work like brain surgery or anything like that. But it's intense work, and it's it's very demanding, and you don't really not demanding. It's time consuming, and it probably intrudes into your life. Your life more than a great number of jobs, and you don't get much time off, and but I wouldn't swap that for the world. So I don't ever think of anything that I'm doing as a journalist as being achieving anything or attaining anything, or it's a really enjoyable job, but it is generally writing about football. I think the times when you are when it can actually do something that's really useful is if I look at some of the stories, say Matt Lawton has done for the Mail and now the Times about doping and stuff like that. That corruption, they are really significant stories. The stories that Danny Taylor has done about the sexual abuse of children, historic sex abuse cases involving various clubs and various coaches, etc. That is something which, if I was Danny, I would be incredibly proud of that. I don't know he is, and rightly so, because that you were telling people's a story that absolutely needed to be told, and ended up with people spending the rest of their lives in prison. And I think that is journalism that's making a difference. And in reality, being realistic about it, 99.9% of sports journalism isn't like that. It's telling, it's writing about football, and that's what I wanted to get into it for. That's what I like doing most. But I also love telling people stories on a human level, and enabling people to tell stories that perhaps hadn't been told before. And I think I don't like achievement or anything like that, but I think the one thing I'm probably proudest of is the book Forever Young, which we talked about, not only because there's sort of 5 years work on and off, and it was an incredible amount of research, and the writing was challenging, etc. But it was telling a story which a family had sort of been desperate for the world to know, but terrified of telling. And to be able to tell that story, and just for them, I think that felt like it wasn't going to be something that brought the world to justice or ended up with somebody being exposed for doping or abuse or anything like that. And it wasn't going to bring closure for that family, but it was a really important step towards, in some way, healing the wound that they have and the upset that they have from Adrian's death. And so, yeah, I think that is the thing that I'm proudest of. I think everything else probably just feels like writing about football, writing about this and that, and it probably feels quite trivial by comparison. But it's telling people stories that I really enjoy.
No, that's awesome. So you've interviewed a number of managers, players, ex-players over the years. But is there one interview in particular that really sticks out in your mind in a memorable sense?
It's a difficult one. I mean, there's so many. I mean, I love interviewing people, and the one thing I don't do is just think, oh, such and so, so and so played so and so this weekend, and West Brom are playing, Leeds in a top of the table match. We need a West Brom interview. I've never got into an interview thinking that. I've always gone thinking somebody has got an interesting story which I want to tell or I want to find out. I would like to do an interview with them. I think sometimes you see interviews in the papers and it's like, it just looks like slightly half-hearted by the journalist in question, by the player in question, where there's not really an interesting story to tell, where it's just a sort of token presence on the pages, so that they've got an element on a particular match on a particular day. And I think, well, I would rather read something more interesting about that player than just or another player than just them sitting there in sweaty training gear thinking, can we finish now? It's some interviews you think you do and you think, God, that was a waste of his time and mine, and I tend to avoid those interviews completely. I like to do people who've got a story to tell, and so I mean, I haven't done that many interviews since I started at the Athletic, but I think the ones I have done have been where I've gone after people with a specific story. And I mentioned the Matt Jansen one earlier. I think that would be the one, taking him back to Rome, showing him, getting him to show me around the streets of Rome and trying to find out where he had this career-changing, life-changing accident on a moped, and he couldn't find it. And so he ended up going back to he ended up saying, well, I don't know where that is, but I know where the place where I got the moped from was. So we went down this little street and he found it. He said, there it is. And he went in and you could see him, he's almost kind of shivering and like, oh my God, this is eerie. I'm going back to this place where my life changed completely. What was it, 17 years earlier? And he went in, put his head around the door, and said, "Oh, do you speak English? I borrowed a bike from here many years ago. I'm just looking. Can I have a photo outside?" And then this guy came out. A guy in his 70s, 80s, came out from the back, and he said, "Yes, I remember you, footballer Jansen. You bought Honda, 500, whatever it was." And this guy not only remembered Matt and remembered the incident and remembered everything, but he then led us back to the place where this accident happened. And Matt was just, it was a really emotional thing for me. Well, for Matt first of all, but for me. And I think the comments on that piece told me that the readers found it emotional too. Living through him going back to the scene of that incident and reliving it and talking about everything that happened next as he tried and failed really to put his career and his life back together. And I think, well, that could have been an interview we did on the phone, and it would have been good because we would have got, you'd have gone through all the things that he talked about in his book. But I think it was I think it was a really good idea from Alex, who I keep eulogizing, Alex Kajelski on our desk, who said, take him back to Rome. That's the way to do that interview. And I think that was the one that was a really enjoyable interview. And the other one that sticks in mind is one I did with Joey Barton when he'd just broken into Man City's team. Let me think, 2006 it was. And he was getting a bit of a name for himself and doing well, and wasn't too far off the England squad. And he was, and he just didn't care, Joey. And I still think he doesn't care about upsetting anybody. If he feels like he's telling the truth, that is more important to him than treading around people's feelings and people's sensibilities. And he's not very diplomatic, but that was he criticised England players for the way they played in the World Cup, and criticised them for bringing books out, and said, when I get into the England squad, I'm not going to be making the numbers up. I'm going to be breathing down Gerrard's and Lampard's. But that's a completely different type of interview, because it's knockabout stuff in journalism language. It's stuff that might then get certain players answering back. But that, as an experience, was enjoyable too, because it's you don't get many players who talk in that really unguarded, unafraid manner. So I'd say the people who are best to interview are those who really got a fascinating story to tell, and those who aren't afraid to say what they think. And there aren't too many of either, really. But yeah, those interviews are really good.
Totally agree. You mentioned earlier about covering England at major tournaments. What is that like? I mean, obviously you've got many games in a short space of time, and it's always hot news when England are still in the tournament. So what's that like when you're covering up World Cups and the Euros?
Well, I've been to, let me think, 2, 6, 7, 14, 18. I've reported on 4 World Cups from 2006 onwards. And I would say that, the first one I was a roving reporter. The middle 2 in 2010, 2014, I was reporting on England. The fourth one in Russia, I was a floating reporter. And I would say that I definitely got those the wrong way around, because the England in 2010, look, there was it was dynamite in some ways, because there was so many tensions behind the scenes. There was so many stories seeping out, but it was really miserable. The whole, going to the England camp in near Rustenburg every day was it felt like everybody, players, the FA comm staff, the reporters, everybody felt like they were, it felt miserable from the start, because they'd gone there under a bit of a cloud. There'd been 1 or 2 issues in the build-up, issues with Fabio Capello, and Rio Ferdinand got injured on the first day. There'd been a lot of expectation before that, but just nothing felt right. And then they drew the first game against America. That soured the mood further. Negative mood going into the second game against Algeria. That was just the worst.
Oh, that was horrific. Yeah.
Horrendous match. Horrendous. Although they won the third game against
just
against Slovenia or Slovakia.
Yeah.
God, absolute shame. I've got a blank. They then got pasted by Germany in the round of 16, and that was a strange experience. And I enjoyed it journalistically, because there were a lot of stories coming out, and Matt Dickinson and I were covering it for the Times. We felt like we were, on top of everything, and we were kind of, we were coping well journalistically. But it was a really unhappy camp, I would say. Even the tensions between the journalists, because there were stories coming out, and there were tensions between the FA and the journalists, and the players and the journalists. Pretty miserable. I remember going, once England got knocked out, we were meant to stay with the camp until, we weren't meant to break free until, I can't remember, it was a game in Cape Town. Yeah, I think Germany then went in to play Argentina in Cape Town. And I insisted on breaking out and going on making my own way to Port Elizabeth, where I went to see Brazil play Holland. So I kind of broke from the herd, because I was you just go stir crazy in there with the same people, same restaurants, same tensions, the same journalists day after day. Breaking free from that England, from Sun City where we were staying, to go to that Brazil Holland game felt like breaking out of prison or something like that. It was all a bit prison-like in South Africa. In Brazil, it was different because we were in a city in the middle of Rio. That was great. But England were, the tournament started. England played, I think, on the third day of the tournament, on Saturday. Yeah, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. The third day, and then they lost. Well, they lost to Italy, lost to Uruguay, and they were out. They were out by about the 8th day of the tournament. The joke was that England were out before we'd all finished our malaria tablets, which was actually true. We'd been to the Amazon, to Manaus, for the opening game against Italy, where it was sweltering hot and tropical conditions, and all the mosquitoes and we had malaria courses, and England were literally out before they were out before most teams had played the second game. That was just weird. It was like England were never there. England, they went through the motions, played that third game against Costa Rica, but by the time England had got home, it was as if the tournament just started again. It was like a completely different tournament, and it was really enjoyable being in Rio and everything that Rio was. It was just an amazing place. Carnival on the Copacabana sort of every night, with all the Argentinian fans and the Chilean fans and Mexican fans, etc. Really, really enjoyable. But it was, once you got to the end of the tournament, I had to then write something sort of almost reflecting on England's tournament, and it just felt like so long ago that England were an absolute irrelevance in that tournament. Whereas 2006, I'd been not in England camp, but going to the matches. So I was there when they beat Ecuador, and I was there when they lost against Portugal on penalties. That felt that felt like a big deal. But previously, at those previous World Cups, it never really felt like a big deal reporting on England, because it never even reached the stage where it felt like they were going to do something. It felt like they were just going through the motions until they got knocked out. And that brings us to 2018, where I was traveling around the country doing other matches and loving actually feeling like I was seeing the proper World Cup and seeing the proper Russia, rather than being holed up in a training camp somewhere and being detached from everything and being in that England bubble. But in many ways, that was the World Cup where you would have liked to be in that bubble, because the players and the management made this conscious decision. Let's actually engage with the journalists. Let's try and make not feel like they're the enemy. Let's kind of take them on our journey rather than be dragged down their journey, if you know what I mean. Footage of journalists playing darts with Harry Maguire and Jamie Vardy and stuff like that, and it looked so much more convivial and grown up in some, well, childish in some cases, but grown up in others. just more civilized. But then I was still doing the England matches. So when it came to that game against Colombia, I was there for that. Brilliant, brilliant experience. And I'm not somebody who would normally get massively pumped up by watching England. I think I've always had a slightly healthy detachment from the kind of idea that England is the be all and end all. I think some of the journalists are so pumped up around England, which makes me laugh when people say the media is anti-England. I think some of them are almost too desperate for England to win. But that 2018 World Cup, I found myself, being swept along by the feel-good factor that there really was, and just thinking, yeah, God, this is great. An England team doing really well at the World Cup, and that game against Colombia was brilliant. I felt a real thrill watching the penalties, and the quarterfinal against Sweden in Samara a few days later, the going 1-0 up against Croatia in the semi-final, and just thinking, you know what, this is actually going to happen, and I'm actually going to be reporting on an England World Cup final, and that would just seem so big in my lifetime, never mind my journalism career, never mind my day. So that all felt incredibly exciting, and then it obviously unraveled as the second half went on. But it's so varying experiences really reporting on England, and I think the one thing you take from all of that is that the first game can really define the mood around an England camp, because once you get that first good result, the momentum goes from there, as it did in 2018. Whereas once if you stumble in if you draw your first game and the overall impression is negative, I think all the players just end up feeling like that negativity, which is amplified by the media, which is amplified by the public, just consumes them, and it makes for a bad tournament, I think.
Definitely. Just finally, obviously the golden generation gets talked about a lot by the players at the time, journalists who were covering those tournaments. But from your point of view, why do you think the teams at 2002 World Cup, the 2004, 2006 World Cup, as you mentioned, is there one reason you think why they didn't get to a final or achieve what they probably should have done?
No, I think there are loads of reasons. I think there are sort of micro reasons like penalties, which probably ended up becoming a bigger reason because it was self-perpetuating, snowballed in people's minds, and you read of Steven Gerrard trudging up to take that penalty in Gelsenkirchen against Portugal, thinking, just dreading the reaction if he missed. And that's a footballer with the mindset of Steven Gerrard. You've got, so the penalties is a big factor. But I would also say that in a lot of those matches, England didn't really, I would say of 2004 and 2006 against Portugal, they kind of ran out of ideas in those two games.
There's hardly any. Sorry to interrupt, Ollie. There was hardly any games where we actually played really well.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe Denmark in 2002. Apart from that, we sort of just struggled through and nicked results really.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, there have been some. Well, look, there haven't been many really good tournament performances. Going back, I mean, it's interesting now, or over the past few weeks during lockdown, people, all these games from Euro '96 and the 1990 World Cup have been sort of shown again, and people are kind of, I haven't watched any of these sort of vintage matches replayed, and I'd like to in some ways, but everybody's reaction to them on social media is exactly what I thought at the time. Against, in Euro '96, we were terrible against Switzerland. Terrible for the first half against Scotland. Good once after scoring against in the second half against Scotland. Excellent against Holland. Hanging on for dear life against Spain. Excellent against against Germany. Very similar in 1990. Which are matches I remember growing up. I mean, and 86. There've been an awful lot of terrible performances by England at World Cups. Terrible against Portugal and Morocco in 86. Terrible against Ireland in 90. Outplayed by Belgium and Cameroon in 90. Lucky really to win after extra time in both cases. Excellent against West Germany in that semi-final in 96. So those games 90 and 96 against Germany, they felt like kind of heroic defeat, if that's not too galling a phrase. Whereas 2004 and 2006, it just felt like watching them from the press box, and certainly 2012 against Italy. They felt like games where England were kind of hanging on a bit for grim life to get to penalties while also dreading penalties. So that's just me ranting about those particular performances. But in terms of that golden generation, and look, the phrase is used disparagingly and kind of mockingly now because they didn't win anything with England. They didn't get to a final, didn't get to a semi-final. Collectively, as an England team, they failed, and they all absolutely freely admit that. They say that the margins were narrow in terms of penalties on occasions, but they admit that they failed collectively. But if you look at that generation of players, and let's take the Man United ones: Neville, Beckham, Ferdinand once he went there, but Scholes, Rooney. You look at Terry and Lampard and Joe Cole, Chelsea, and Liverpool players: Owen, Carragher, Gerrard, Heskey. Even when he was there, there's Sol Campbell, Ashley Cole. It was a brilliant squad, and those players all won so much together in really, really good Premier League teams. They excelled in the Champions League, all of them. I mentioned someone there, Heskey. Heskey, gets mocked, but Heskey was a very good player for England, very good player in the Champions League for Liverpool. He was, these players have had brilliant careers, and I think, and as that generation kind of came to an end, I was sort of making the point, well, we might disparage them as underachievers on the international stage, but this was probably our, we will do well to get another generation as good as that. I really do feel that. Yet somehow in 2018, despite having, I don't think, anything like as strong a squad, they got to the semi-final, and that I think was down to two things. One is a really gentle route to the final. I think the draw was favourable. It was. Colombia in the second round was tough, but it was a fairly easy group. Sweden in the semi-final, quarter-final, and then a Croatia in the semi-final, which was winnable. So I do think that the route was perhaps a lot easier than they'd had in previous tournaments. But also, Gareth Southgate just managed the team in a completely different way. And it was as if he'd learned from every mistake that previous England managers had made. And he looked at it and thought, these players need to feel like they're not rivals coming from different clubs. We've heard and read stuff in recent years from players talking about cliques, a Liverpool clique here, a Manchester United clique there, Chelsea clique, Arsenal clique. I sensed that when I was reporting on England in 2010 in particular, that there were so many tensions between the different groups, and different players have admitted to that since. But it's Southgate seemed to foster this unity and just really kind of work on the friendships and the unity between all the players, who were coming. A lot of them were coming together not as proven winners from various clubs. They were often kind of players who were a big player at a club who hadn't won anything, like Harry Kane at Spurs, or they were kind of Harry Maguire at Leicester, who was on the way up, or Trippier, or Trent Alexander, or Alexander-Arnold, or it was Jordan Pickford at Everton. It was all these players who were kind of had something to prove, and the only way they were going to prove that was by being collective. And I think Southgate created a mood and a unity amongst them, which was totally different to what Capello and Eriksson and Hodgson were able to create. And I think Hodgson, England in 2014 and 2016, the performances were pretty disastrous. The results were pretty disastrous, but I do feel like he did at least kind of iron out a few of those difficulties, a few of those tensions, got rid of, started to bring through a new generation of players and helped them to start maybe thinking a bit differently about England and a bit, regarding England as something to be looking forward to rather than something to dread. And I think frequently it became something to dread because of the results. But I think since Southgate came in, I think he's worked on that culture and brought through a lot of players who have worked together with him in the 21s and who get on well together, regardless of which clubs they play for. And so that is a different. It does feel like there's a different culture around the world, around the team now. Whereas, 2006, 2010, it just felt like a kind of squad full of superstars where there were ego. I don't even really think it's fair to accuse the players of egos, because Gerrard and Lampard and John Terry and Ferdinand, etc., would not have achieved what they did if they were like some impossible egos. But it just felt like the personalities of the players almost sort of weighed too heavily at times. And the managers didn't really know how to handle the different dynamics of different players. Whereas, I feel like Southgate has probably got an England team which is, I'm not going to say more than the sum of its parts, but it probably does feel like the sum of its parts. And I think maybe the challenge for him will become if players, if come Euro 2021 or 2020 or whatever we're going to call it, Harry Kane will have a different aura, reputation by then. Raheem Sterling will. Jadon Sancho will be probably be a big star on the international stage by then. And there will be, I'd say it will probably feel more pressurised on all of those individuals than it did in 2018. I think 2018 they rode that wave really nicely, whereas I think in the previous tournaments they just ended up being knocked over by the first real wave they hit.
I totally agree. Well, thanks, Ollie. That was absolutely brilliant. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks everyone for watching this. If you are new to our channel and you enjoy our content, please subscribe to us and hit that notification bell. If you want to listen to this back in the audio version on iTunes, Spotify, etc., the links in the description below, and that's where you also find our Facebook and Twitter pages. And if you've got any ideas of who you want us to interview next, whether it's a journalist, broadcaster, commentator, ex-manager, ex-player, just let us in the comments below, or send us a message on social media. Thanks again for Ollie for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.